Now on this particular model, all you have to do is just bolt this thing right back up the way that you put it in, and of course you'll need to line these bolts up with the holes in the strut tower, and that was the reason for making somewhere on here this paint mark that I can line up so I know it'll go exactly correctly. But I can't replace this yet because I still have the issue with this torn CV boot that caused a bad CV joint here. So we got to get this axle replaced before the strut goes in. So I'm going to set that aside, and what we're going to have to do first is get this axle nut off from the hub. And as usual, there's a cotter pin here that I'll have to remove first, a little cover, and then take off the nut. So let's go ahead and do that. So first thing is to straighten out and replace or remove this cotter pin. Sometimes these are kind of a pain. There we go, not too bad. Get this cover off. And this axle nut here is often a bear. If you don't have an impact gun, there's a couple tricks you can do. One is to reinstall the brake here. Have a friend step hard on the brake while you try to break that loose. Certainly some penetrating oil on it first helps a little bit. Another method, one of my favorites, is to actually do this. It's to reinstall the wheel without the decorative center cap, and then lower the vehicle, and if you reinstall the wheel you'll be able to get your socket into the hole here, and because the weight of the vehicle will be on the tire, you'll be able to break that loose. So that's another way. You're going to need a big breaker bar to do this. So I think on in my experience on small, cars like Hondas, Toyotas, things like that, it's not too bad to do. On something like a truck or a high performance car, these can be a real problem. One of the things you don't want to do, it may occur to you to try to put a pry bar or something between the lugs here, and then try to use that to hold the wheel in position. In my experience, you're going to end up stripping your lug bolts here. So don't do that. I don't think that's a great way of doing it. You may be able to get away with it if you put the lug nuts on first, but even then, I have bent these before trying to do that method, so I don't really recommend it. All right, lucky for me, that comes off pretty easy with the impact gun. And what I can do now is remove the rotor. First I'm going to have to get this brake caliper off though. Alright, now, not too worried about where all these go because remember I always have the other side to look off of, but that will remove. And usually what I like to do is keep the bolts with the part I remove so I don't have a whole pile of bolts to go through that I wonder what they're for. Alright, so next there's usually a washer there. Right there, and get this rotor off. Now sometimes on these Japanese cars they have screws that hold the rotors in. Why they do that I don't know. Looks like these are newer rotors, there's no wear on them, so it looks like they just didn't put the screws on, which is fine with me. Those screws normally are a big pain, so let's get something where I can break this rotor loose. Put something soft behind the rotor and hit it with a hammer. And there it goes. Okay, and that rotor looks great. This is clearly a new rotor. And now we can see the CV here. Now, what I want to do is again not mushroom the end of this. So let me put this on here and break that loose just a bit. Now on most cars you will have to remove or disconnect. Show you here. There is a tie rod right here that you'll normally have to disconnect. I don't think I'm going to have to do it on this model, so I'm pretty happy about that. Usually you'll have to either disconnect the tie rod or lower ball joint to free up this assembly so that you can remove the axle. I don't think I'm going to have to do that here, so that's good news. If you do remove the tie rod, make sure that you don't twist the tie rod back here. Let's see if you can see that even. All right, so here's your tie rod assembly. It needs to go back exactly the way it came on. If you disconnect this assembly and you twist it around and stuff, you'll offset your alignment. So just keep that in mind. Let's see if we can get this axle through. There we go. All right, great. This is kind of a nice thing about this model is normally you've got to mess with this lower ball joint or the tie rod here, but I don't have to worry about that, so this is easy. Now what I've got to do is get under the car, and I've got to free the axle up from the transmission. That can be a little bit messy, so let's get under there. All right, so what we're looking at here is where the end of that axle fits into the transmission, and what I've done is place a drain pan under this because a little bit of transmission fluid is probably going to spill out when I do this, and a little hard to do this holding the camera, but hang on a second here. All right, what I've got is a pry bar here, and what I'm going to do is just pry that out of there. I may not be able to do this holding the camera. Sometimes you got to muscle it out a little bit. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to put the camera down and do this with two hands. All right, and now I got my axle here. You can see the point of my frustrations there. There's a little C-clip here, and this is really all that holds this in. You just have to hammer hard enough or pry hard enough to get this C-clip past the transmission. So this is the whole axle assembly that we're going to replace with a new one. Again, you can sometimes rebuild these. This is that hole there that's going to make this a bad assembly. You can see in there maybe there's some ball bearings, so you can actually cut these clamps, remove this boot, check the ball bearings are okay, reseal them with grease, and then put a new boot on. But at $50, I'm just going to replace this assembly. But for those of you that are very penny conscious, you can certainly do that for just a few bucks. So, got the new axle assembly, and this just pops right in to place. Just in place of the old one. You see we've got a new C-clip here on this one. If you reuse the other axle assembly, in my opinion, you should replace this C-clip as well as the boot. So we're going to pop this in, put a little grease on the splines, and it should just pop right in place, and then we can finish up doing this suspension. On the assembly of the axle you just punch it right back into the transmission until it locks. You'll know when it locks. This axle nut here on the hub, this on many vehicles can be like 190 foot-pounds if you've got a truck or something like that. So there's a lot of torque on these, but make sure you torque that to spec. And there will be a new axle nut that comes with your axle, by the way. I've got a cotter pin back in there and everything. So what we are going to do now, oh, by the way, I also reinstalled my caliper mount there. So what we are going to do now is reinstall this strut. So the first thing is put a little grease on the contact points, as always. And I find it easier to do the top mount first. Yeah, shoot, where's the nuts for it? Hang on. All right, here they are. So I find it easier to, again, line up my paint marks here and feed this up. These paint marks right here are lined up, so I know that I've got everything in the right position. And I'm just going to hand tighten the top nuts right now, and then fit this back into the knuckle. All right, there's one. Once you get one in, you're home free. There's two. All right. Get these back on. Oops, that's a lug nut. There we go. All right, that's just going to spin around on me, so let's hold that with a wrench. Make sure you watch your fingers. All right, and then you'll want to look up, because every vehicle is going to have a different torque setting on these, but you'll want to look what that is. Get on there. There we go. Same thing for the lower one. There we go. Then finish up top, tightening all of your mounts. And don't forget your dust cap. All right, and back down here where the action is. Now that we've got our strut in place, we can go ahead and I've already got the caliper mount there, but we can go ahead and put our caliper back on. Now, actually, before we do that, there's a little thing that I want to do here. Let me get some brake grease. All right, whenever doing brake and stuff, I use a brake and caliper specific grease. It's a little bit more resistant to moisture than regular grease. And what I like to do is, I call them the ears on the brake pad, but I just put a little, not on the brake pad surface itself, and certainly not anywhere near the rotor, but just a little bit of this grease onto the pads. I also sometimes use some disc brake quiet stuff on the back of the pads as well. I don't think I have any right now, but this will help. So you got a little grease there. And then I'm going to check to make sure all the hardware is in place. And this is the pad for the outside here. So it's going to go in like this. You're going to be very careful not to get the grease, on the surface of the rotor. And maybe someday I'll show how to do a full all-out brake job, at least how I do one. Really probably should have got new brake pads for this, but all right, so the brake pads are in place. Remember that had these kind of kinky springs here that go into these holes that are in the brake pads. And there we go. All right. And another thing is the mounting hardware for the calipers. Remember, there's two different size bolts, so keep that in mind. And these are kind of floating pins here, so a little grease on the shoulders of these bolts here. Also, on some models, there will be some floating pins that actually pull out of the caliper itself. This one doesn't seem to have it, but sometimes you can pull pins right out of the boot here. You want to grease those up as well. But again, we're not doing a brake job here. We're trying to just put this together. And may have to push this piston back into the bore, but probably not since we're using the same brake pads. All right, so let's see if we can get this on and make sure we don't tangle up our brake hose here. And let's see. Oh yeah, that'll fit on just fine. All right, so this short bolt went into the bottom. There we go. And the long one up into the top. All right, there we go. Little brake cleaner on there. Make sure we get rid of any grease or whatever we might have put on the rotor. And last but not least, the clip to retain the brake line, if you remember. There we go. And then the final step, of course, put the tire on and you are done. So I think that'll be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it.